All right, I'm joined by our panelists tonight. Donald Smith is a professor emeritus of history at the University of Calgary. He's written about John A. Macdonald's relationship with Indigenous peoples. Sean Carleton, also in Calgary, is a historian and associate professor at Mount Royal University in Calgary. And Crystal Sinclair is an Indigenous rights activist and the founder of the I Don't Know More Toronto Welcome All. First off, let me just get your position. Sean, starting with you. Do you agree or disagree with removing Sir John A. Macdonald's name from schools?
I strongly approve the ETFO's motion because I think it shows they're taking the responsibility of reconciliation seriously. They're studying and looking for ways to implement the 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And as good educators, they're reflecting on ways to try and improve the teaching and learning environments of our schools.
Okay,
so I strongly support.
We're going to get more into the reasons. What's your position?
Well, I strongly disagree. I would use the phrase time out. Let's take a time out, because this has been, the TRC report is so shocking, so revelatory, and we haven't even begun. It's like going in a dark room with a candle. There's all kinds of other things that will come up and put things in different perspective. So that's my advice, time out.
Okay. Crystal, how do you feel about the idea of removing names from not just schools, but buildings and perhaps the thin edge of the wedge?
Yes, I would agree that's a step in the right direction, and this conversation is a long time coming. Our community, the Indigenous community, has had to live with the effects of those policies of removal of children into residential schools, clearing the plains and, the Indian Act. And we've lived under an oppressive system for over 500 years. So,
but a lot of people are saying now, is renaming the way to go? Why not extend the understanding of Sir John A.'s legacy in schools through curriculum instead of removing his name?
I'm not saying that we don't tell the history of what John A. Macdonald, his legacy has done to Indigenous people, because the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has done a lot of work exposing what happened in residential schools. The thing is, this legacy continues today. We have a disproportionate amount of people in jail. We have murdered and missing women. We have children who are committing suicide in northern communities. I mean, we should be up in arms of this. Why should we honor a hero? That is my question. And to me, it's like saying, well, these young children whose minds are going into school are being told this one story, a colonial story of Sir John A. Macdonald, painting a picture of him, the Confederate father of Canada, but really the story is the legacy of how we've had to live with that oppression.
Okay, Don, John A. Macdonald, clearly he helped build Canada, one of the founding fathers, very big personality in Canadian history. Does he bear sole responsibility or culpable for this Indian Act and for the residential schools, and therefore should he be removed from any honoring of him?
Let's start with the positive. He's the founder of Canada. Great strengths, great weaknesses. He is the one, though, that had the genius to reach out to French Canadians in the 1850s. And that's how we get Confederation. He treated them as equals. The negative is he and his generation did not do the same for the First Nations. And we are paying the price of that now. But overall, let's look at the accomplishment. He created a country which has tremendous possibilities, and we owe him that. He brought in French Canadians, he brought in the Maritimes, and kept it together. An almost impossible task. For that, he deserves to be acknowledged and remembered. At the same time, I'm with exactly the others on this, in the sense that there's from our vantage point today, a very, very horrible side to it, and we know the repercussions of that. But at the time, and we must, look at the past through the eyes, not through the eyes of the present, but try and see it through the eyes of the time. These people, and the majority, had a blind spot. That's the title of a book I'm writing right now. The blind spot. They didn't see the history and the culture of the First Nations.
But Don, the problem with this argument is that even at the time, in the 19th century, John A. Macdonald's controversial policies were being criticized by his peers. In 1888, the grip published a political cartoon that called attention to John A. Macdonald's deliberate starvation of Indigenous peoples to build this country and to create that whereaway. So I feel like it's a misrepresentation of history to say that he was not criticized for those policies at the time.
Sean, one of the reasons you said you applauded the teachers' union for bringing this to the forefront, one of the reasons they suggest is that children will feel safer in schools that aren't named after John A. Macdonald. How is that?
Well, I think in our age of reconciliation, teachers across the country are reflecting on the way in which we teach about the past. And for 150 years, Canadian history has been taught about celebrating fathers of Confederation uncritically. And in today's age of reconciliation, a more truthful, balanced approach to the past needs to be understood. And teachers are finding it very frustrating to advance that particular kind of history and still explain to students why their school is named after, say, John A. Macdonald in an honoring and celebratory way.
Crystal, history is nuanced. There's a lot of gray in history.
That's right.
As Don said, you know, through the lens of yesterday, things appear wrong today. Is there some other way to achieve the objective with kids in schools than to take nameplates off or tear down statues?
Well, I still agree that taking the name down off the schools is a very important step in the right direction. These teachers have come to realize that in order for reconciliation to proceed, you have to speak the truth. So with John A. Macdonald, we understand what he did to Indigenous people of this country. Like the Indian Act segregated us from society. We weren't allowed to vote. You know, 1960 is not that long ago, and that's when we could vote. You know, a lot of poverty stems from his policies, a lot of racism. So when I see that, I see, you know, I don't see a hero, I see institutionalized racism. So where does this stop? We can't say that we were blindsided. He was very intentional. The Indian Act is very intentional. It set out all these discriminatory and racist policies, and you can't deny it. If you want to go back and read that Indian Act, there it is. So what we need to know now today is how we move forward. What are we teaching these children? We have to tell them the Indigenous history as well. You're talking about the colonial history. Myself, I'm a survivor of that colonial history. The Indian Act that stopped me from progressing in my people and being part of mainstream society. We have history. We've been on this land pre-colonial times. This is our land and our territories, and we shared that.
Right.
But at some point, he has to be acknowledged for who he is.
And Crystal makes a really good point, because Canadians need to remember that for tens of thousands of years, Indigenous peoples living in what is now today Canada had their own names for things, from everything from settlements to mountains to rivers. And when settlers from Europe came, they simply just changed those names without any consideration in the process of colonization and building a new nation. So we need to remember that naming, and not just renaming, is a political act. It's not neutral, and it needs to be debated in this country.
Can I intervene,
Don,
please?
Yes, Don, I wanted to ask you about whether naming is where we should put the priority, or should it be elsewhere? And also, is this the thin edge of a wedge, a greater debate about all kinds of people far in the past who will be reconsidered?
I am very much scared about this naming business, because it's just a cop-out from doing hard work. There's so much complexity to Macdonald alone, and then all his peers who endorsed this policy. This was almost universally accepted. Yes, there was it's terrible, shameful, the starvation policy, but the Liberals wanted to reduce the rations even more than the Conservatives. And as regards the vote, Macdonald, this is the extraordinary part, he extended the franchise to the First Nations in central Canada and eastern Canada without them having to lose their status. This is incredible. Later, the Liberals took that away. He gave the vote.
So, Crystal, less than a minute left. Is this, at the very least, a good conversation to put before Canadians?
Oh, yes, it is. In this time of truth and reconciliation, we have to speak the truth, and you have to hear the truth in the Indigenous history of this lands. And so moving forward, we need to look at the 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation, and taking steps to action of those recommendations is a very important step as well.
All right. Thank you very much, all three of you, Crystal, Sean, and Don in Calgary. Appreciate it.